So welcome to this FemQuant seminar. Our speaker today is Dr. Marie Bergström. Marie is a sociologist and a researcher at the French Institute for Demographic Studies, or INED. Research interests are sexuality, couple formation, and singlehood. And one of her major research projects focuses on online dating in the heterosexual population. The main results of this project were published in 2022 in her book, The New Laws of Love, Online Dating and the Privatization of Intimacy. And today she'll present some analysis using digital data to observe gender dynamics in heterosexual dating. So thank you for joining us, Marie, and the mic is yours.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you all for connecting. So I'm really happy to be able to talk a little bit about my research and then discuss it with you later on. So I'm gonna share my screen to present what I'm gonna do. Is that good? Yeah. Perfect. So yes, I'm gonna, as Jenny said, I'm gonna talk a little bit about my research, focusing specifically on how I've been using data from dating platforms to study gender dynamics in dating. And what I thought I'd do is I'm gonna present in 4 different points. I'll just start with a really short introduction, and then I'll go into a little bit why I think that it's interesting to use this new type of data coming from the internet platforms. So why are dating sites interesting as an observation site? And then I'll go in more specifically, so why it's interesting for scholars interested in gender and sexuality, and then I'll rapidly conclude. So it's kind of a talk that, mixed as methodology, but I also hope that I'm going to present findings that you find interesting on gender in dating. So just a short introduction on my research on online dating. So it's really a long-running research project because it started off as my PhD thesis, and then it turned into my postdoc project, and then I kind of still do what one could say a scientific watch, because I still have this project kind of on the side. I do other things as well, but I have this project on the side because it's a practice that's evolving and there's regularly new data, new surveys coming out, and so I try to understand how things are also changing. And in this research project, I really have a twofold approach. First of all, and mainly, of course, online dating for me is really a research topic, meaning that I'm trying to understand how people use these platforms, what they do, and how it changes things. Does it change how we meet, how we date, who we meet, and does it change our representations of love and sex, etc.? So the transformations of intimacy coming with this new mode of meeting venue. But then I have another approach that is more about using the data from these platforms and kind of revisit classical questions in the social sciences. So there the focus is not so much about the specificity of online dating, it's rather asking what this new data can say about topics that we've been studying with survey data, and does it change anything, does it change the results, etc. And it's really more on this aspect that I'm going to talk today. But in the project, more generally speaking, I also have had a two-sided approach, in the sense that I've been looking at the production side. I was interested in the companies behind these platforms, and so I did interviews with the entrepreneurs and the tech people doing these platforms. But mainly I've been studying usage, and we should know that I'm studying heterosexual usage, so I will only talk about that today, and I can come back to why I've decided to focus on this if you want to. And I also have a mixed method approach, because I've been doing interviews, as I said, with the dating entrepreneurs, but also and mainly with users in France, coming from different social backgrounds and from different ages. And then I've been using also quantitative sources, so surveys, generally surveys where at some point that sometimes ask people, have you ever connected to an online dating site or app, or have you met your partner that way? And these are often surveys that are on sexual health or couple formation, internet use, etc. And lastly, I've used digital data from the Match company, which is actually owned by a French company called Mythique. And it's with the Mythique company that I get some data, and I'm going to present more in more detail what type of data this is later on. And so, as Jenny said, the findings of my research have been published in this book from last year. But today I'm really going to focus, as I said, more on this data issues and how this new sources of information can tell us something new about how people meet and the gender issues that are raised from this. So before going into that, just a quick word about the topic of my research. So dating sites and apps, it's digital platforms that are specifically and explicitly dedicated to partner matching. So that means that I'm not studying people meeting through Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, or other types of platforms. It's really these Tinder, Bumble, all these product services that are really focused on partner matching. And actually, they are becoming an increasingly important meeting venue in the Western world and also beyond the Western world, but we have mainly data on Europe and North America. And I just put here some results from 3 countries. It's really difficult to compare the usage rate between countries because the services are super different, but we can look at the evolution of usage within each country. And so we have the percentage of individuals who said that, yes, I have already used an online dating site or platform or app. And in France, the data is a bit old, but in 2014, it was 14%. In the United States, it's all American adults aged 18 and over. And in 2019, we had 30% saying that they had ever used a dating platform. In Germany, it's the PairFem study, so it was framed a little bit differently, and it was about currently using online dating, and we had a little more than 20% that said yes. So that makes for quite a fair share of people, and actually it's becoming a really important way of meeting your spouse. This was once again 3 different surveys, quite recent, and it's the percentage of people who met through different meeting venues 3 years prior to the survey. So it's recent couples that are that we have information on in these different surveys. So as you can see in Germany, online dating doesn't make up for a really big share of the couples. It's more family or friends or work or school that are really important. That goes for the US as well, but online dating is more important. It comes in 3rd place, whereas in the recent GGS survey from Sweden, it represents 30% of couples that met within 3 years before the survey. And now, as you might know, we have a lot of new GGS surveys that are going to roll out all over Europe. So I think we're going to have comparable data pretty fast. So what we can say from this is that I think that what is not true is that online dating has become the most important way of meeting. It's true for certain countries for sure, but not all. I think we sometimes tend to overestimate, and especially the media tends to say that, it kind of wiped out all the other ways of meeting. This is absolutely not true. People still meet through family and friends, work or school, etc. But it is becoming more important, and I think it's squeezing meeting through bar, restaurants, nightclubs, and other kind of public venues. But we can discuss that later, but it's just to show you already that it's become quite important, especially in certain countries. And this is also why it becomes interesting as a data source, but because, of course, if online dating was a really marginal, statistically rare phenomena, the dating coming from there would be very specific. I mean, it's still the case. It's not like survey data, but of course, the data is more relevant now that we have so many people using these platforms. And actually, more and more scholars are using the data coming from these platforms to do research in the social sciences. And this growing scientific literature is mainly focused on topics revolving around partner choice. So partner choice generally, or more specifically, issues about social homogamy and racial homogamy. And there's a lot of US scholars that have been using this data. These studies are use two types of data. It's data coming from user profiles. So people say who they are and present themselves. And then, and this is important, it's data on interactions, on contact patterns. So you can look at who contacts whom. And that's what makes it interesting to be able to see interactions. And that means that all of these studies, with few exceptions, are collaborations between universities and private companies. So it's not web scraping, because if you do web scraping, you'll get the profiles, right? So you need to have work with the platform to get the back office information, so to say. And so why is this interesting? Because you could say that, you know, when it comes to couple formation or relationships, we have a lot of data, and that's true, and we have really nice representative high quality data that comes from administrative data, censuses, fiscal data, population registers, memory register, etc., where we have information on couples, on the two partners. And we also have a lot of questionnaires that are either longitudinal or cross-sectional, where you can get information on the respondent and his or her partner. And so you have really these really rich sources, and they're mainly used for two things. I think when you look at the literature, you have studies that have more maybe demographic approach, that is to describe the composition of couples and unions, that's to say who is married to whom, who is with whom, what is the rate of homogamy, for example, what is the age gap between spouses. And so it's really to describe the couples. But then you have another approach as well, where these sources are used to analyze the partner market. So those are questions, research questions around partner preferences, matching, and partner choice. So that's kind of more a question on the input, like how come that these couples are formed the way they are formed. And it's specifically there where I think that actually surveys are not a very good tool to go into studying partner market. There are really certain problems with that. Because when you think about it, if you want to study couple formations, well, the surveys and the administrative data is really on already formed unions. So it's a kind of ex post facto approach, meaning as social scientists, you can say that either you can say that we are kind of like marriage photographers. You know, we do photos of couples and we can describe them, but we don't have so much information on what happened beforehand or what they met. Or we're like detectives, they arrive on the scene of the crime after it happened, and then we kind of try to understand how we got there. And there's a lot of literature that really reasons right like that, meaning that you have people using surveys and trying to understand the preferences and the matchings behind the couple formation. And that's quite a common way to proceed. And I would say that this relies really on a way of reasoning that is to consider couples as revealed preferences, saying that the couple says something about the two partners' desires and what they seek in a partner. And that is really a theory that comes from economy in the beginning. It's a theory of consumption, where Samuelson said in the 30s that if you want to know people's preferences in terms of products, there is no need to ask them what they like. You can just look at what they buy. And what they buy is revealing of what they like and their preferences. And really, social scientists, we reason in a very similar matter when we look at couples in surveys, and we say that, well, you have couples that are, for instance, homogeneous in terms of education. And we often say, well, then people seek someone who has the same education. And so we kind of consider that the couple is the reflection, the expression of the preference of the partner. So preference from partner one plus preference per partner two makes up for a couple. And this is where it gets tricky. And I think that it really has a lot of problems, this way of reasoning. And I think there's problems in this at many different levels. And I think we have an immediate empirical problem, which is simply that our choices do not necessarily reflect our preferences. And when it comes to couple formation, for example, if when women tend to be in a couple with a man that's more highly educated than her, it's not necessarily that both partners seek that, it could be that men are seek out women who are less educated than them, or that they have more possibilities of choosing who to date, so to say. So I think it's really problematic to deduce our preferences from our partners. There's a methodological problem because there's also a confusion between different levels of analysis. Often in the literature, you have an average pattern on the population level, and people induce individual preferences from this population pattern. And that's also a problem. And then you have a theoretical problem that Pierre Bourdieu called a scholastic fallacy. That is really, as he said, a serious mistake in the social scientists to put the models that the scientist must construct to account for practices into the consciousness of the agents. To briefly put it, to say that the indicators that we use to describe the social world, sometimes we tend to believe that those are actually the way people reason in realities. That would mean, for example, that if we as sociologists or as social scientists see that couples tend to be homogeneous in terms of education, we think that actually partners seek out other people with a similar education, and that would be their criteria for dating. And that's, of course, a huge problem as well, to think that our models, our theoretical models, are actually reflected or the same as the criteria that people use when they're dating. So to put it very briefly, there's a lot of problems using surveys to study dating, basically because we have this deductive ex post approach. And that's where online dating comes in, because it's a really different way of looking at things. First of all, it doesn't look at couples. It looks really at the very first contacts, the very first behaviors where people try to reach out to each other. So it's really on the opposite end of the whole dating process. And actually gives empirical information on how people date. So it's the input rather than the output. It's interesting also because we can look at not only partner selection, but also rejection. Whereas in surveys, we have people who actually ended up being together, maybe even getting married, etc. Whereas with the online dating data, we can see people starting talking to each other, but we can also see all the patterns where some groups try to contact other groups, but they get rejected and turned down. And that's also, of course, part of the dating process. It's also different because in surveys, we rely on declarations. People say who they are and what they do. With big data and digital data, we look at what they do rather than what they say that they do, and this can be interesting. And it's also a way to assess, process it, and to have a dynamic approach, because with big data, we all often have multiple points of observations, much more than in surveys. And I think that with all these multiple points of observation, we can really reconstruct evolution patterns and dynamics, which is really interesting as for a social scientist interested in processual phenomena. And for the first time, we can actually access processes quantitatively, which I think is quite new. So those are kind of like a background for like why should we even bother going into this data? And now, of course, I have a focus on specifically what can this type of data tell us about gender dynamics in this specific field that I'm interested in, that is dating and relationship formation. And I'm going to focus on a study that I did that is on the age gap between partners, meaning the age differences between men and women in heterosexual relationships. And it's an article that I published that's called What's Behind the Age Gap Between Spouses. And the reason why I think the age gap is really interesting, I think it's very, very revealing of gender dynamics in dating. And it's also something that I find fascinating because it's an exceptionally strong statistical trend, meaning that this trend that men tend to be slightly older than their female partner, it's a trend that we find in almost all human societies, meaning that if you look at historical periods, you will find this pattern. And if you look at data from various countries in the world, you will find this pattern. And so I think we're really in front of a trend that's, I mean, some author has really called it an anthropological constant or a universal human norm. And I saw when you do quantitative research, it's always fascinating when you stumble on things that are so incredibly consistent over time and space. And as gender scholars, it's interesting because, of course, from my point of view, this is not just some neutral demographic indicator. It is an expression of gender inequality, because age is an expression of stratification. We live in societies where age and being older is a status of authority, which means that in almost all human societies, parents have the authority of children. Older siblings over younger siblings, older colleagues over younger colleagues, etc., meaning that we have a society that is stratified by age, and it comes with the power relations. And in that context, the fact that women are younger than men in the heterosexual couples mean that it is a question of power relations, and the imbalance in age really expresses the gendered imbalance of power that is that comes out in heterosexual relations. So that makes it interesting to me. And then you can go into asking, so what are the gender dynamics behind this trend? What is happening here? And if you use the kind of traditional ex post facto approach that I talked about, well, there's kind of an easy answer to that. Like, yeah, there's not so much to it, because yeah, men prefer younger women and women prefer older men, meaning that the couples and the age gap would be revealing of men's and women's preferences, and there are supposedly a preference for this difference in age. Actually, as for all the reasons that I said earlier, I don't think we can deduce preferences. So what's interesting is going in, looking at what are men's and women's age preferences, what are the matching mechanisms, and what are the underlying gender dynamics. And that's what I tried to do in this paper. So I'm going to show you what I found. And this paper really was a methodological part where I wanted to understand what can big data tell us that surveys cannot, as I wanted to confront the different types of sources. And so I used a French survey that's called the PIC survey. It was made in 2013 and 14. Respondents were aged 26 to 65, was a random sample. And with this survey, I have data on partner characteristics for those who were in a couple, but also partner preferences. And there was a question in this survey where they asked to everyone, would you consider being with someone who was 5 years older than you or more, or 5 years younger than you or more? And so I used this question. What I was interested in, because of course it's interesting to see who are those men and how many are they that accept older women, and how many women and who are the women who accept younger men. And that's the information I used. And then I have big data from the Mythic company, that's Match in the UK. And I have anonymized profile data, so stated characteristics. People state their gender, age, and lots of characteristics, but also their partner preferences. So it's anonymized profiles. And then I have interactional data. So it's I don't have access to the content of the messages. I have only metadata, but what I know is that user A contacted user B, and then I can see, did B respond to A or not? And so the sample I used here was a sample of 400,000 profiles and over 25 million messages that were exchanged in 2014. So I'm going to show you the results from the paper, starting from the EPIC survey. What can this survey tell us? Well, first of all, it can tell us something about couple characteristics, and it shows something that we already knew that there's an age gap, and in 68% of heterosexual couples, there is an age gap in favor of the man, and in 21% of the couples, the woman is older. And you can see the distribution here, meaning that here are the percentage of people where there is no difference in age. These are the couples in percentage where there's an age gap in favor of men, and these are the share of couples where there's an age difference where she is older. So as you can see, there are couples where she is older, but it's mostly couples where she's slightly older. It's really rare to have couples where women are, for example, 5 years older than he. And this survey also asked people, as I said, would they expect being with someone who's older and younger than them? And I looked at what the share of women and men who are open to an unusual age gap. The idea was to see how many women and men would say that, yeah, sure, I could be in a couple where she's older than the man. And what I see from these results, and it corresponds to the results that we have in France, so it's quite consistent with earlier findings, it's that around 80% of men said that yes, they would accept an older spouse, but only 53 women say that they would expect a younger spouse. So in this sense, it's really the age gap is really a female preference, much more than a male preference. And as you can see, the reluctance among women is really strongest among the young one. Here you see the percentage of people that are open to an unusual age gap per age group. And it's actually young women who are the most reluctant to the idea of being with a younger partner. Only 30% would accept that. And I think this result is really disturbing because if we say that the age gap is an expression of gender inequality, well, this result means that women are seeking out that inequality, that the age gap and the imbalance in power relations between women and men is mainly due to female preferences. And that raises a lot of theoretical questions about how we understand male domination and consent to domination. But in this paper, I was also interested in the empirical issues that are raised, because I think that maybe women and men do not answer the same way to this question. And maybe it's difficult sometimes to use surveys to understand preferences. And that's where I think that the online dating data has something to say. So I'm going to switch to that part. So on this same question, what can we see from this MITIC data? I have two types of information. I'm going to show you some results. The first one is on the stated age preferences. So that means what people say in their profiles and what kind of partner they would like to meet. And then I have demonstrated age preferences, meaning I look at contact behavior and independently of what they say that they seek, who are they actually trying to contact? So if we start with the stated age preferences, this is quite a classic thing on dating apps, and you find it on Meetic and Match. When you sign up, you are asked to put in an age range for your preferred partners. And we can take that information and see what are the type of age ranges that women and men put on this platform. And you have this result here. So what we see here is the median age range that is put by women and men per age. And so it's presented in terms of relative to one's own age. So the way to read this is if you look, for example, at women age 25, well, you will see that women age 25 tend to put an age range that goes from their own age to 11 years older. So that would mean that they say 25 to 36, for example. And so what we can see from these trends is that if you take women, we can see that women, when they are young, indeed, they have an age range that are higher than their own age. But then something happens towards 40, and women start being more interested in people that are a little bit younger or a little bit older. And then if you look at older women, well, you see that they have a more clear preferences for younger men. And when we look at men, we see a tendency that follows the same trend, but it's much more emphasized, meaning that young men actually say that they seek older women, knowing that you need to be 18 to go on the site, and you can't say that you're seeking people who are 17. So guys who are 18 actually need to put an age range higher, but as you can see, when the possibility opens up for them to say that they look for younger women, well, they do so. And actually men are much more concentrated and on younger women than older women. So just from there's something that does not fit with what we see from the survey. Men do not seem to be so interested in older women. So I took this same data, but I just presented it a little differently. The question in the survey was, would you consider being with someone 5 years older or more, or younger or more? And I thought it was interesting to look at the data in the same terms. So what you see here is the percentage per sex and age group, the percentage of people that put an age range that, when it comes to women, includes partners that are 5 years younger or more. And for men, the percentage of men who put in an age rank that includes partners that are 5 years older or more. And then I confronted to the survey data. Let's see if I can, there we go. And what you see, if we look at women, first of all, you can see that, well, the trends are quite similar, meaning that you have, young women are particularly reluctant to younger partners, but when women get older, they open up to this idea and this perspective. And actually, behind these two sets of data, the correlation is really strong. So it's not exactly the same share, but we see something going on there that's quite looking the same way. On the other hand, if we look at men, we see results that are very different. In the survey, men say, no problem, yes, would accept an older woman. But when they go online, men using the dating app, they seem much less interested in older women. And so we have the difference in the data and the results. We have some coherence between the two sources of data when it comes to women, but we have a much larger difference and contrast when it comes to the results with regard to men. How come? I'm really happy to discuss this with you. My interpretation is that I don't think that men and women answer the question in the survey the same way. I think that women are much more conscious of their partner preferences than men, because we know, especially from qualitative research, that women talk more about what they expect from a partner, their experiences about partner, what they want, what they do not want. And I think when there is a survey and they're supposed to answer what they seek, they actually have already thought about it. So the answer is quite easy. Maybe for men, the reflexivity is lesser. And maybe if you find so large parts of men saying, yeah, sure, I would consider that, well, maybe that answer does not really reflect what they do. Maybe they found it hard to answer the question. Maybe they didn't take it seriously. Maybe there's lots of reasons, but maybe they had troubles answering the way, what they expect from partners. It's an hypothesis. I'm happy to discuss it. I'm going to switch and I'm going to finish with that on the demonstrated age preferences, because that's what people say in the profile, but who do people actually contact? What we see here is the median age gap in contact behavior, and it's presented as an age gap in favor of the man. So that means that if we look at the red line, that's women. So this means that women aged 18 to 24 tend to seek out men on the platform that are on average 5 years older, whereas women that are 60 to 70 tend to on average seek out men that are 2 years younger than them. And men who are 18 to 24 tend to seek out women who are 1 year older than them. Whereas men who are 60 to 70 on average contact women who are 5 years younger than them. That's how you read it. And what's interesting in this graph is the cross. This means that the attitudes toward the traditional age gap are not at all the same among women and men. It's very different depending on age, and the trend is diametrically opposite for both genders. So we have huge contrast in the way that women and men, their expectations towards that traditional age gap. And I think what we can say from that is that, sure, the age gap between spouses is a super strong, unequivocal statistical trend, but the processes behind that trend, what people expect, what they look for and what they seek for, are not that easy to interpret. It's much more complex. What's for sure is that it's not a univocal preference for an age gap. So the age gap, which is the output, is the result of different processes. And I'm going to show just one last graph, which shows that there's some compromising going on here. What I did here is that I looked at the average age preferred among women that they stated in their profile. This is that black line. And the preferred age gap that men put in their profile is the gray line. And then I plotted the actual age gap between correspondents. So what you see is, you know, the cross is still there. We can see that young women prefer older men, but when women go older, they are more interested in young men. And we see the opposite. We see a trend where men also seek out younger women when they grow older. And this line in the middle shows pretty well that actually female and male preferences differ. And the age gap is a compromise, because the age gap, the dotted line, is really in between. The two lines, meaning that female and male attitudes toward age gap are really contrasting, really different, but they need to meet somewhere, right? So there's kind of negotiation going on, and there's kind of a compromise, and the compromise is in the middle. But as you can also see, the dotted line is much more close to the male preference than female preferences. It follows more the gray line. Why? But that's because men send much more messages on the dating platforms, and they often take the initiative. So they weigh more, so to say, on the negotiations, and they're being more active on the site. So they kind of do a pre-selection, and women tend to be in a position where they just need to respond to the male initiative. So this means that the age gap is a compromise between male and female desires, but it is a compromise that tends to advantage men, because the final output is closer to their desires. So I'm going to stop there and just conclude to try to wrap it up, both on the methodological part, but also the age gap part. So when it comes to the methodology, what I'm trying to say and what I think is interesting is, I think this new data really can say something else, say something new on topics on relationship formation. It's not representative. It had lots of problems and limitations. I haven't talked about it, but I'm really happy to do so in the discussion. Of course, it's really dirty data, and it's really problematic in certain ways, but I think we should use it because it says something that surveys cannot say. It has information that's really different from survey information. What we have in surveys are empirical evidence on what couples look like, but we know nothing about the matching process, and we know nothing about preferences. We need to deduce them. Online dating data is the real opposite. We have empirical indications of preferences, and we have empirical indications of matching. However, we have really no clue what that's gonna become. Are people gonna go on a date? Are they gonna start a couple? We know nothing. So I think it's really putting the two together, comparing the two data together. We have two pieces of the puzzles that focuses on very different stages in the couple formation process, and it's by confronting the two that you can think we can get the bigger picture. So I think what I'm trying to say is that we should use more different types of data, not be afraid of unrepresentative data. It can say something, and it can kind of put some light on the blind spots that are left by survey research. And when it comes to gender dynamics in dating, what I think is interesting with this data is that I think we have a really lots of interesting research on the gender inequalities that comes when the couple is already there. When people live together, when they're having relationship together, we see inequalities in household work, in socioeconomic status, in violence, and we have lots of research on that. But what I find interesting is kind of to take a step back and look also at the differences and inequalities when it comes really to the couple formation, really from the first start, the first meeting. The inequalities between women and men in heterosexuality do not start when they become a couple. It starts with the first email. There's something that's really different from scratch. And I think it's interesting to kind of to start looking at these inequalities from the very beginning of their relationships. And yeah, heterosexual couples are far from a perfect match because actually women and men have different preferences and they have very different attitudes towards the age gap. And this differs at different stages of their life, but in very different ways for both women and men. So this means that the univocal statistical trend is not at all due to univocal preferences. You cannot deduce preferences from the aggregated statistical result. And it's really obvious when it comes to the age gap because it is a compromise between female and male desires. And as in other parts of the social world, we see gender inequality. And in this case, it tends to favor men's desires. So I'll stop there. Thank you.